There is a particular kind of silence that lives only in arrangements between people who did not choose each other. I know because I have spent 22 years transcribing that silence into telegraph wire, compressing human need into 40 words or fewer, charging by the character, watching people try to fit their entire lives into the space between the periods. I know the silence between words. What I did not know until October of 1889 was that some silences carry more weight than language ever could. I was standing at the edge of the Cascia Flats stage platform when Nola Birch stepped down from the coach. She was carrying one trunk, a leather satchel worn at both hinges, and the particular expression of a woman who has agreed to something she cannot fully take back. Not afraid. Not hopeful, calibrated, the way you look when you've done the arithmetic and you're standing in the remainder. Garrett Vane was supposed to be there to meet her. He wasn't. He'd sent me instead. I was his bookkeeper, had been for 3 years, and he'd folded a note into my coat pocket that morning that said, "Tell her the north room has a window that faces the creek. Tell her that first." I remember unfolding that note 3 times before the stage arrived, smoothing it flat against my knee, wondering what kind of man sends a woman a window through a third party. I still don't have an answer I'm satisfied with. What I know is this. By the time I walked Nola Birch from the stage platform to Garrett Vane's ranch house on the north quarter of Cascia Creek, something had already started that neither of them had agreed to. Not in the arrangement. Not in the paper that Aldous Creel had gotten both of them to sign, with his big, persuadable handshake and his absolute confidence that he was doing 2 people a favor. The paper said, 1 year, separate quarters, no obligations beyond cohabitation, for the purposes of satisfying the Homestead Extension Act's domestic residency clause, which required a household of 2 or more adults to qualify for the eastern pasture land Garrett needed to keep his cattle operations solvent through the following decade. The paper didn't say anything about a tin inside a boot. It didn't say anything about a ring. It didn't say anything about what a man does when the person he is performing a practical life for turns out to see him more clearly than anyone has since the woman he lost, and he doesn't know what to do with being seen. This is what I watched happen across a full year in Montana territory from my position behind a ranch ledger and a stack of dog-eared telegraph forms I never sent. I'm writing it down now because I believe some things deserve more than 40 characters. Some things deserve every word you can give them, even the ones that don't resolve cleanly. The first thing Nola Birch said when she set her trunk down inside Garrett Vane's front room was, "I want to understand the terms." Not hello, not thank you for having me or any of the social scaffolding a person uses to manage a room full of awkwardness. Terms. She stood in the center of the rug Garrett's mother had braided from strips of old coats in 1872, set her satchel on top of the trunk, crossed her hands in front of her, and said it like she was addressing a school board. Which I realized later, she probably was, in her mind. She'd been addressing school boards for 5 years. Traveling county to county in Montana territory, filling one-room schoolhouse vacancies that the state couldn't hold a permanent teacher for. She had learned early that the people who controlled the paperwork did not always have your interests at the center of their planning. She had learned to ask for the terms before she unpacked. I was standing near the door. Garrett was standing near the fireplace where he'd been when we arrived, as if he'd positioned himself there deliberately, far enough from the door not to seem like he was waiting, close enough to the warmth not to seem indifferent. He was wearing a clean shirt. I noticed that. I noticed that he'd changed into a clean shirt for this, which was the kind of thing Garrett Vane did not usually bother with unless it was Sunday or a land assessment. He said, "The terms are in the paper." Nola said, "I know what's in the paper. I want to understand them." There was a difference, and she expected him to know what the difference was. The pause that followed was about 4 seconds long. I smoothed the corner of a telegraph form in my coat pocket. My own nervous habit, I'd had it since I first started working the relay station in Billings in 1867, when I was 24 and every message that came through felt like it was carrying the weight of someone's entire life. I still carried blank forms. I still dog-eared the corners when something was happening that I couldn't file away neatly, and smoothed them flat when I was trying to think. Garrett pulled a chair from the table and set it near her trunk. "Sit down," he said, then, registering something in her expression, "Please." She sat. He stayed standing. Not dominantly, it wasn't that. He was the kind of man who thought better on his feet, and I had learned in 3 years of working his books that his best decisions were made while he was moving or holding something. He picked up a length of fence wire from the hearth mantel. He'd been meaning to take it back to the barn for a week and kept forgetting, and turned it over in his hands while he talked. "The East Quarter parcel," he said, "which is 240 acres of usable pasture land plus a creek access point, cannot be added to this title without proof of established household. That's the law as it currently reads in this territory, and it's the law Aldous used to make his case for the arrangement. If I don't have a household of 2 adults by the end of October, the parcel goes back to open claim, and Aldous' son puts his name on it before spring. And Aldous' son is not a man who should be controlling a creek access point." He said it flatly, without elaboration, and Nola accepted this without pressing. She was good at reading the shape of what people were not saying. I noticed that about her in the first 20 minutes. "The north room," she said, "which your bookkeeper told me faces the creek." "It does. Is there a lock on the door?" Garrett blinked. This was not a question he had anticipated, and the small, involuntary blink told me so. "There wasn't," he said. "I put one on this morning." Something shifted very slightly in Nola's posture. Not warmth, it was too early for warmth, but something like the recalibration you make when a piece of information adjusts your estimate of a situation. She nodded. "I teach," she said. "I'll need to establish the school arrangement with the county board. I presume Kasha Flats has children. 14 that I know of. I'll need a room for teaching, something separate from the house. There's a sod house behind the barn. Hasn't been used in 6 years, but the walls are sound. I'll need paper and chalk. Delaney can order them." He gestured at me. I nodded. I had already made a note. This is how it began. Not with ceremony, not with the performance of 2 people trying to seem compatible, with logistics. With a fence wire turned in a man's hands, and a woman who wanted the terms explained before she committed to living inside them. I found it, against all my expectations, rather dignified. The first 2 weeks established a rhythm. Nola rose before Garrett. I know this because I arrived at 6:30 most mornings to work the books, and twice in the first week I found her coffee already made and cooling in the pot, with a second cup turned upside down beside it on the counter. The second cup was not a gesture. It was, I decided, simply the way she made coffee. You make enough for the people in the house. Garrett drank it. He didn't comment on it. He was not by nature a commenting man. Pell, his ranch hand, described Garrett once to me, in confidence, while we were repairing the south fence, as a man who had something to say and decided against it so many times that the deciding against became its own kind of speech. I thought that was remarkably accurate for a man who communicated primarily in approximate weather metaphors. Pell would say a situation was 8 degrees north of settled, or coming in sideways like a late October front, and somehow always be correct. The situation between Garrett and Nola, Pell told me by the 3rd week of October, was building weather. Not a storm, he clarified, leaning on the fence post. Building weather, the kind where the air changes before the clouds do. You know it's going to be something, but you don't know yet if it's the good kind or the difficult kind. I dog-eared a telegraph form in my pocket. I wasn't going to argue with him. The sod house became a schoolroom by October 22nd. Nola did most of the work herself, swept it, remudded a crack in the north wall, commandeered 2 plank boards from the barn to make a rough writing surface, and borrowed Garrett's chalk supply from the pantry shelf where he kept it for marking cattle. When she asked about the chalk, she knocked on the door frame of the room he used as an office, the one with the surveying maps pinned to the wall and the leather-bound stock ledger on the corner desk, and said, "I need chalk." "May I take the chalk from the pantry shelf?" Garrett looked up from the stock ledger. "It's chalk." "It's yours." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man encountering a distinction he had not previously considered. "Take the chalk," he said. "Thank you." She turned to go. "Nola." She stopped. "There's more in the supply box in the barn. Top shelf left side. Better quality than the pantry chalk." She thanked him again and went to the barn. I was in the office when it happened, totaling the September grain costs, and I did not look up from the ledger immediately. When I did, Garrett had gone back to his stock counts, but his pencil wasn't moving. The discovery happened on October 29th, 15 days in. I know the exact date because I had to write it in the ranch log. I write the date at the top of each day's entries, a habit from the telegraph station where the timestamp was everything. And when I wrote October 29th, the morning had already turned strange. Nola had been looking for the bootjack. It was one of those ordinary, entirely practical errands. Her boot was stiff, and she'd tried the doorframe twice and finally decided to find the dedicated tool. She'd asked Pell, who'd said it was likely in the mudroom or Garrett's room, and Garrett was out at the south pasture checking the fence line, so Nola went into his room to look. She found it under the edge of the bed frame. And beside the bootjack, pushed against the wall under the far side of the bed, was Garrett's left boot from the previous day, the one he'd already swapped out for his work boots that morning. And it was standing upright, which was unusual for a boot that had simply been kicked off, and the reason it was standing upright was that there was something inside it. She told me this herself. Not immediately. It took until the evening, when Garrett had come in from the south pasture, and they'd had supper separately, Nola in the north room with a plate and a county school report she was reading, Garrett at the kitchen table with his stock ledger. When Garrett retired to his room, Nola came and knocked on the door of the small side room where I was finishing the October accounts. She sat down on the stool across from my chair and put her hands flat on the table in front of her. This was, I would come to learn, her thinking posture. Hands flat, weight forward slightly, looking at the middle distance. "I found something," she said, "that I was not looking for. In the mudroom." "In his room," she paused. "I was looking for the bootjack. I found it, but his left boot from yesterday was standing against the wall and I could see something in it. I shouldn't have looked. I looked. I waited. A tin, the kind saddle soap comes in, small, maybe 2 inches across. The label had been torn off and the edges were worn flat. There was a ring inside it. I kept my expression as still as I could. A ring. Plain iron, no stone. Sized for a man, she looked at me directly. A ring that was not on his hand. I smoothed the corners of 3 telegraph forms in my coat pocket without taking them out. I was doing the arithmetic the same way I imagined she was. If the ring was there, it wasn't lost. If it wasn't on his hand, it was kept, not worn. There is a specific grammar to things that are kept rather than worn, and Nola Birch, who had been reading the grammar of human behavior for long enough to know the difference between honest disorganization and deliberate placement, had already parsed it. "Did you take it out of the tin?" I asked. "No." "Did you move the tin?" "No," she paused again. "I put the boot back exactly as I found it." I nodded. I was deciding in that moment how much I knew and how much of what I knew was mine to say. Garrett had not told me everything. He'd told me enough over 3 years that I'd assembled the shape of it myself, the way you do when you work someone's accounts long enough that the numbers stop being just numbers. "There was a woman," I said carefully, "before, a long time before the arrangement." Nola's hands stayed flat on the table. "He was engaged to her," I said. "Her name was Della Marsh. She died in the winter of 1881, diphtheria. She was 26. I paused. "I know this because Vera Lund at the seamstress shop mentioned her once in passing when I was picking up a mended coat for Garrett. Vera said Della had come in for a fitting for a winter dress the week before she got sick. Vera still had the dress form measurement in her records." Nola was quiet. "I don't know anything about the ring," I said, which was true. I had not known about the ring. "He kept it," Nola said, not accusatorially, carefully, like she was examining a document. "Yes. In his boot. It appears so." She looked at the middle distance again. I watched the side of her face and thought about what kind of woman processes the discovery that the man she has a legal arrangement with has been keeping his dead fiancé's ring in a saddle soap tin inside his left boot, and does not appear shaken by it, but rather more, I didn't have the right word. Attentive, like something had come into better focus. "I'm not going to ask him about it," she said. "That's probably..." "Yet," she said. She didn't ask him about it for 8 more days. In those 8 days, the school began. 11 children came on the first morning. Nola had gone to 5 homesteads personally in the preceding week, introduced herself, explained the arrangement, and simply stated the hours. She had a way of presenting information that made refusal feel like more effort than agreement. By the second week, 13 children were attending, including 2 who'd been listed as too far for practical travel, because their older brother started bringing them on his saddle horse, and staying to help Nola stack the firewood. Garrett noticed the school. He didn't say much about it, but I saw him adjust the water route for the cattle to avoid crossing near the sod house during school hours. He did it without announcing it. He just changed the route. Pell noticed. He told me the situation had moved from building weather to a particular kind of still that he associated with the moment before the first flake of a heavy snowfall. Perfectly quiet, he said, like the air knows something's about to commit. The confrontation, though that's too large a word for what it was, happened on the evening of November 6th. It had been a long day. 3 of the cattle had gotten through the east fence and needed an hour of recovery. Nola had kept school an extra 40 minutes because 2 of the older children were working on a division problem that she didn't want to leave unfinished. By the time she came in from the sod house, Garrett had already eaten and was sitting at the kitchen table in his reading posture, which was actually his thinking posture, the same as Nola's, except that he held the stock ledger open in front of him and didn't read it. He just kept it open. She came in, took off her coat, hung it on the peg, and stood for a moment with her back to him. Then she turned and said, "I found the tin in your boot." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the wood stove was the loudest thing in it. Garrett did not move immediately. He closed the stock ledger. He set his palms on the table. I thought, when Nola described this to me, that it was interesting. They both went to flat palms when they were trying to be honest. "When?" he said. "October 29th. He nodded once, the nod of a man absorbing a timeline. "I didn't take it out," she said. "I put the boot back the way I found it. I'm telling you now because it seemed wrong to know something about you and not say so, even in an arrangement." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was not there. I have Nola's account of what followed, told to me the next morning over the coffee pot, in the careful, precise language of a woman who was still working out what she felt about it." He reached into his breast pocket. He kept it there now, she told me, had moved it from the tin sometime in the last week. He set the ring on the kitchen table between them, in the small space between his hand and hers. It sat there, plain iron, worn slightly on the outer edge. Small for a ring, Della Marsh had been a small woman. I knew Vera had mentioned that when she mentioned the dress form. "Her name was Della," he said. "I know," Nola said. "Vera Lund told Delaney. Delaney told me." A beat passed. Garrett looked at the ring. "I didn't tell Aldous about her," he said. "When Aldous proposed the arrangement, I let him believe this was straightforward." "Was it not?" He picked the ring up, held it in his closed fist. Nola counted, she told me she counted, she didn't know why, 17 seconds. Then he opened his fist and looked at it lying in his palm. "She'd been dead 8 years, he said. "I told myself that was enough time for it to be straightforward." A pause that lasted almost as long as the 17 seconds. "I was wrong about that." Nola did not say anything immediately. She was looking at his face, not the ring. She told me later that this was the first moment she saw him clearly. Not the man who had put a lock on her door that morning and sent a window through a third party, but whoever was underneath that, the one who had been carrying a dead woman's ring in a saddle-soaked tin in his boot for 8 years, because returning it felt like claiming the right to be finished. She reached across the table, not to take the ring. She put 2 fingers on the back of his closed fist, not gripping, not holding, just resting there for about 4 seconds. Then she took her hand back and said, "Thank you for telling me her name." She went to the north room. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, with the ring in his open palm and the stock ledger closed in front of him. I know because Pell saw him through the kitchen window when he came in from the barn to check the coal supply. Pell came and told me the next morning. He said the weather had changed. "Changed how?" I asked. He thought about it. "The kind of change," he said, "where the storm already passed and you didn't notice because you were inside." November arrived in Montana territory the way it always did, without negotiation. The temperature dropped 17 degrees in 2 days, and the creek north of the house developed a skin of ice along its edges that thickened every morning by an inch. Pell brought in extra coal. Garrett reinforced the barn door hinges against the wind. Nola ordered her first supply requisition through the county school board, chalk, 20 sheets of paper, 2 reading primers, a replacement protractor, and asked me to add a crate of pencils to the ranch order. I added the pencils. I also added a small iron wood stove for the sod house, which I listed in the ranch accounts under structure maintenance without consulting Garrett, because I had seen Nola's breath in the sod house at 8 in the morning, and I had made a practical decision. Garrett reviewed the accounts on the 15th of each month. He saw the stove. He did not remove it from the ledger. He circled it in pencil and wrote the word correct in the margin, which was his notation for expenses he approved retroactively. That was the closest thing to tenderness I saw from him in November. The ring stayed in his breast pocket. Nola didn't mention it again, and Garrett didn't take it out. But she was aware of it in the way you're aware of a thing you've agreed not to look at directly. It was present in every room they shared. Not as a wound, exactly, more like a watermark, something that showed up when the light was at a certain angle. I thought about it constantly. I kept smoothing telegraph forms. What I was working out, and what I believe Nola was also working out, though she would have expressed it with more precision than I can, was whether the ring was a barrier or a record. Whether Garrett was a man still living inside a grief that had closed over him, or a man who had simply never been given the language to explain why he was still holding on. Those are different situations. They require different responses. You can wait out a man who doesn't have the words. You cannot wait out a man who has decided the past is more real than the present. I didn't know yet which kind he was. I don't think in November he knew either. The thing about a marriage of convenience, even one as carefully papered and term-specific as the arrangement between Garrett Vane and Nola Birch, is that convenience itself is not a static condition. It shifts. The things that were convenient in October, when you are still constructing the parameters of your cohabitation, become something else by November when you have settled into the rhythms, and rhythms have a way of becoming something you notice only when they're interrupted. Nola kept the north room meticulously. She had arranged the 4 objects she'd brought with personal significance: a small framed photograph of her parents, a worn copy of a geography atlas that she'd been given by the teacher who'd first hired her, a folded piece of fabric she never explained, and a dark blue ceramic inkwell in a precise line on the windowsill. Every morning the photograph was at the left, the inkwell at the right, the atlas and the fabric between them. I noticed this because my own desk was by the north-facing window in the small side office, and on the days when I arrived before Nola was up, I could see her windowsill through the partially open door of the north room. The arrangement never changed. It was the kind of order a person maintains when they have moved often enough that they've stopped expecting the geography around them to be stable. So they build stability in miniature. Garrett noticed the inkwell. I know this because in late November, when the county school order came in on the supply wagon, I was unloading it with Pell when I found a second ceramic inkwell in the order, dark green, slightly larger, a higher quality clay that I had not ordered. I asked Garrett about it later. He said he'd added it when I sent the order because Nola had mentioned that the blue one cracked in cold weather. She mentioned that, I said. In passing, he said. I thought about that. He was not a man who retained things mentioned in passing. He retained things that mattered. He had just filed her inkwell cracks in the cold, in the category of things that mattered. I smoothed a telegraph form flat in my pocket. The school was the most honest thing that happened in November. 13 children, ages 5 to 14, in a sod-walled room that smelled of chalk dust and wet wool, and the pine resin of Garrett's leftover fence stakes that Nola had used to make a low shelf for the primers. She was a methodical teacher. She did not perform enthusiasm. She did not over-explain. She trusted children to follow a thought if you gave them the beginning and the end, and let them build the middle. The children, in the way children do with adults who treat them as capable, worked for her in a way they hadn't worked for the previous circuit teacher, who had apparently conducted school as a sequence of recitations. Vera Lund's granddaughter came home from the sod house one November afternoon and correctly calculated the volume of a grain bin that the family had been estimating wrong for years. Her grandfather used the correct figure that spring and avoided an overorder. Vera told me. She seemed mildly overwhelmed by the outcome. Garrett heard about this from Pell, who had a cousin connected to the Lund family by way of a shared fence line. He said nothing about it at supper. But that night, I arrived early the following morning and found that he had left a stack of the survey maps from the office wall in a neat pile outside the door of the sod house. He'd attached a note. I read the note before Nola did, because I was there first. It said, "These may be useful for geography. Return when finished. GV." There were 9 maps. They covered the full Cassia Creek Basin and 3 neighboring territories. I thought about the man who had sent a window through a third party and decided that he communicated in objects and provisions rather than words, and that this was not cold exactly, but rather a different dialect. Nola, when she found them, held each one up to the sod house window in the early light and studied them with the expression of someone receiving something that was precisely what they needed. She taught with those maps for 4 months. The first significant breach in the arrangement's paper surface happened in early December, in a way that I suspect neither of them planned. It was a Sunday evening. I wasn't there, but Pell was in the barn and heard enough to give me the shape of it, and they were in the kitchen at the same time, which happened more often now that the cold had compressed the available warm space. Nola was writing her school records at the kitchen table. Garrett was sharpening a knife on the whetstone near the window. They had been in the same room for about 45 minutes without conversation, which was not unusual. They had developed a capacity for occupying shared space without demanding acknowledgement from each other that I found remarkable in two people who had been strangers 7 weeks prior. Then Nola said, without looking up from her records, "Did you love her very much?" The whetstone sound stopped. A long pause. Pell from the barn said he heard the whetstone stop and then a sound like a man setting down something heavy, which was probably the knife. "Yes," Garrett said. "Were you," she paused, and the pause was careful, "were you happy before?" Another long pause. "I don't know if happy is the word," he said finally. "I was complete. The way a thing is complete before it gets broken. You don't know what complete feels like until you're not." Nola was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've never been complete. I don't think. I've been useful and I've been occupied and I've been good at things. But I don't know if I've been complete." He said, "Do you want to be?" She looked up at him then. Pell saw this part through the barn window in the lit-up square of the kitchen. She looked at him for a long moment, this woman with her careful hands and her flat-palmed thinking and her precise distinctions. She said, "I think that's a question that's not covered by the arrangement." "No," he said, "it's not." They went on sitting in the kitchen until the lamp burned low. Pell went to bed. I have only the outline of what they said after that, which is probably correct. Some things lose their nature when you put them in words immediately. They need to remain in outline for a while. December brought the first real snow, and with it Aldous Creel. Aldous was the kind of man who visited in winter specifically, because he calculated that people were less likely to argue with him when they were cold. He arrived on December 11th in a borrowed sleigh, wearing a beaver fur coat and the expression of a man who had been satisfied with himself for so long that he'd forgotten what the alternative felt like. He had brought a bottle of whiskey and what he called good news about the land. The good news, as he explained it over the kitchen table while Nola sat in the north room with the door not fully closed. She was listening. I later confirmed from her geography atlas was this. He had been in contact with the Territorial Land Office and had identified a pathway to extend the East Quarter claim by an additional 60 acres, which would take Garrett's land to just over 300 acres of usable pasture, which was, by Aldis's estimate, enough to sustain a cattle operation of twice his current size. The pathway required the arrangement to be made permanent. Not an extension of the 1-year agreement, a conversion. A legal marriage on record with the territorial clerk's office in Billings. "You'd both benefit," Aldis said. He was looking at Garrett, not at the north room door. "She'd have security, you'd have the land. The county education board would likely give her a permanent posting instead of a circuit one. Everyone comes out ahead." Garrett looked at the whiskey bottle, which he hadn't opened. "Did you ask her about this before you asked me?" "I thought it better to." "Did you ask her?" Aldis's expression shifted slightly. "I thought." "She's in the next room," Garrett said. "You can ask her." Aldis looked at the north room door. He called out. There was a theatrical quality to it, the way a man calls out to someone when he already knows the answer he's expecting. "Nola, I imagine you've been hearing this. What do you think?" A pause, long enough that Aldis began to look slightly less settled. Then Nola opened the door and came and stood in the kitchen doorway. She was holding her geography atlas. I don't think she'd been reading it. She'd been holding it the way I held telegraph forms, for the texture of having something in your hands. She said, "I think the question of whether this arrangement becomes a marriage is not a land question, Mr. Creel. I think you know that." Aldous said something about practicalities. Nola said, yes. Practically speaking, I'll need to know what you told each of us about the other before we signed your paper, because I don't think you told either of us everything. The kitchen was very quiet. Garrett looked at Aldous with an expression I had seen exactly once before, the time he had discovered that a grain supplier had short-waited 3 deliveries over 2 seasons and had adjusted his accounts so gradually that the discrepancy was almost invisible. It was not anger. It was the look of a man recalculating a situation he had allowed to run too long on the wrong assumption. "What did you tell her about me?" he asked Aldous, very level. Aldous said something about presenting the situation favorably. "What did you tell me about her?" Nola asked. "More about presenting the situation favorably." What it came to, and this took another 20 minutes of Aldous talking around the edges of it, was that he had told Nola that Garrett was a widower whose wife had passed recently, implying recent grief rather than 8-year-old grief, which had presumably made the arrangement seem more mutual and less like what it actually was, a land maneuver. And he had told Garrett that Nola had applied for the arrangement because she needed settled housing, which was partially true, but left out that she'd been coerced into it by a county school board that had decided a settled teacher meant a housed teacher, and that the alternative had been losing her circuit posting entirely. They had both been maneuvered by a man who thought maneuvering people was the same as helping them. Aldous left with his whiskey unopened. He did not seem to register the extent to which the situation had been altered by the conversation. He was the kind of man who didn't. After he left, Garrett and Nola sat at the kitchen table, not in their usual separate territories, but across from each other directly, and I believe they had the most honest conversation they'd had since the night Nola had asked about Della. I know this not because I was there, but because the following morning when I arrived, the atlas was on the kitchen table and not on the windowsill, and Garrett had left a note on my desk that said, "Review the East Quarter boundary documentation." I want to know what would happen if the title were filed in 2 names. I reviewed it. I'll tell you what I found in Part 3. January was the school's finest month. Nola, emboldened by the survey maps and by a supply order that Garrett had supplemented with a full set of arithmetic primers from the Billings catalog without being asked, extended the school day by 30 minutes and began teaching the older children land survey notation, the kind of practical mathematics that in Montana Territory in 1890 was the difference between knowing what you owned and finding out you'd been wrong for a decade. I helped sometimes, in the afternoons when the accounts were done. I'd been a telegraph relay operator for 12 years and had a reasonably sound grasp of geometry and notation. Nola treated my presence in the schoolroom with neither ceremony nor awkwardness. She simply handed me the chalk when she needed me to diagram something on the board, and I diagrammed it, and we went on. Garrett came to the schoolroom door once in January, on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow had softened enough for afternoon light to come through the window at an angle. He stood in the door frame. He didn't come in, and watched Nola explain a land area calculation to a 12-year-old girl with the patience of a person who genuinely believes the other person is capable of understanding if given enough time and the right angle of approach. He stood there for approximately 3 minutes, then he went back to the barn. Pell told me the weather had done something unusual. "No word for it exactly," he said. "Like when the snow settles and you can hear things from farther away than usual, everything carries different." I smoothed a telegraph form. I thought I might be beginning to understand what he meant. The morally heavy thing happened in February. Aldous came back. This time without the whiskey and without the sleigh, he came on his horse, which was a sign of urgency, because Aldous Creel did not ride in February if he could help it. He came with documentation from the Territorial Land Office, and the news that the East Quarter parcel had been submitted for open claim by his son, Ellis, who had apparently gotten impatient waiting for Garrett to convert the arrangement. The documentation gave Garrett 30 days to file a superior claim. The superior claim required either the permanent marriage conversion or proof of household establishment that satisfied the extended residency clause, which meant, essentially, that the arrangement had to either become a marriage or produce documentation of household establishment going back to October 14th. Household establishment documentation. I was the bookkeeper. I had 3 months of records. I could file them in a day. But Aldis's second piece of news was the complicating one. He had, he said, spoken to the county school board in Billings. And the county school board, in its interest in regularizing the schooling situation in Cassia Flats, had offered Nola a permanent teaching appointment, housed, salaried, county-funded at the new district school that was being built in Cassia Flats proper. The appointment was hers if she wanted it. It did not require the arrangement. It did not require Garrett's ranch. It did not require anything she had agreed to in October. It was, Aldis presented it, the generous resolution. Everyone gets what they need, everyone walks away satisfied, Nola takes the appointment, Garrett. Well, Garrett didn't get the East Quarter, but he kept the North Quarter and the main operation, and that was, Aldis said, a reasonable outcome. I was in the office when Aldis presented this. The door was open. I was not pretending not to listen. Garrett did not answer immediately. He was doing the thing with the fence wire again, turning it in his hands. He'd kept a piece of it near the fireplace mantel since October. I had begun to understand that this was his equivalent of my telegraph forms. He said, "What does Nola think?" Aldis said he hadn't spoken to Nola yet. "Then why," Garrett said, "are you speaking to me first again?" There was a long silence. Then Aldis said, "Because you're the one with the land at stake." "No," Garrett said, "I'm not the only one with something at stake." And he went and knocked on the north room door and told Nola that Aldis was here with an offer and that she should hear it herself. She heard it. She asked 3 clarifying questions: the salary, the start date, the status of the current schoolroom arrangement in the sod house. Then she said she needed 24 hours to consider it. Aldis left. Garrett said nothing that evening, but late, past the time I usually stayed, though I had stayed because I was totaling the accounts, and because, honestly, I needed to know, he came to the office door and said, "Delaney, if the household documentation is filed without the marriage conversion, just the residency record, is the East Quarter claim defensible?" Against Ellis's claim specifically, yes. The dates are solid. The records go to October 14th. Can it be filed in 2 names? I had already reviewed this. The title can be filed as a household establishment claim with 2 named residents. It doesn't require legal marriage. It requires documented cohabitation and the residency period. He nodded. "Garrett," I said. He looked at me. "If you file it in 2 names, she owns a quarter of the east parcel regardless of whether the arrangement continues." "I know," he said. I paused, "that's what you want." He turned the fence wire in his hands. "The East Quarter was the reason for the arrangement," he said. "That doesn't mean it's the reason for everything after." He went to bed. I sat at my desk for a long time after that, with a blank telegraph form in my hands, and smoothed the corner flat, and tried to find the words for what I had just witnessed, and found that 40 characters was nowhere near enough. Nola took the 24 hours. She was precise about it. She told me afterward that she had spent the time doing the specific arithmetic she did whenever a decision had large consequences. She listed what each option assumed about the future, and she looked for the assumptions that she was making on someone else's behalf. The county appointment assumed she would be a teaching position and nothing more. It assumed that the thing she'd built in the sod house was a starting point, not a destination. It assumed that what had developed between herself and Garrett Vane since October was either unimportant or too early to be weighted. The second assumption was the one she stayed on. When the 24 hours were up, she came to the kitchen in the morning, where Garrett was already there with the coffee she hadn't made yet. He'd made it himself, which he never did when she was in the house. And she sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table and said, "I'm not taking the county appointment." He looked at her. "Not because of the arrangement," she said. "The arrangement ends in October, and I don't think either of us should make a decision about what comes after that in February, when we're both still inside it and can't see clearly." He nodded. "But I'm not taking the appointment because I want to see what the sod house school becomes, and because the children in this valley deserve to be taught by someone who knows the land they're growing up on, and because—" She stopped. A rare stop for Nola. She looked at the coffee cup. "Because I would like to know what it feels like to stay somewhere long enough to understand it." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll file the East Quarter claim in both names." She looked up at him. "You don't have to." "The arrangement was supposed to benefit both of us," he said. Aldous made sure it mostly benefited me. I'm correcting that. She looked at him steadily. That's not what the arrangement said. No, he said, it isn't. The coffee was getting cold. Neither of them moved to pick it up. Garrett, she said, after a moment, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is that you don't know. All right. Are you making this decision because of the arrangement, or are you making it because of something that's happened since? The longest pause I had not been present for, she told me the length of it herself. Long enough that she counted the seconds and stopped at 31 because she decided if she got to 40, she was going to withdraw the question. At 29, he said, both, and I don't think I can separate them clearly yet. She nodded, that's honest. I don't know how to be other than that with you anymore, he said. I'm not sure when that happened. She reached across the table. Not to the ring was in his breast pocket and had been since November, and she knew exactly where it was. She put her hand on his forearm, just above the wrist, and held it there for about as long as he had held the ring in his fist that night in November. Then she picked up the coffee cup and drank the cold coffee and said, then let's start from there. March came in soft that year, unusual for Montana territory, where March generally arrived with the specific intention of reminding you that February's relative warmth had been a courtesy, not a commitment. But the third week of March brought a thaw that uncovered the creek edge and the south field and the beginning of the drainage problem in the northeast corner of the east pasture that Nola identified on a Tuesday afternoon when she was walking the property line with one of the survey maps. She came in and found me at the office desk and put the map down in front of me with her finger on the northeast corner. The grade slopes wrong here, she said. If the spring runoff is significant, this corner floods and takes the fence post with it. You'll lose the northeast fence line. I looked at where she was pointing. I had not been to that corner recently. How did you? The elevation lines on the map don't match what I walked. She tapped the contour notation. It's not a large difference, but it's consistent. I sent a note to Garrett. He went out that afternoon and came back 2 hours later with mud on his boots and a pencil notation on a scrap of paper that matched Nola's map correction exactly. He replaced the northeast fence posts the following week, before the significant thaw came. The south field stayed dry through April. He didn't make a production of it. He just fixed the fence. But I noticed him watching Nola at supper that evening with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, not admiration exactly, or not only that. Something more like recognition. The look you get when you realize a person has been showing you what they're made of in small ways all along, and you've been watching without fully assembling the evidence. April was the school's expansion. 2 families from the southern range sent their children for the first time. The sod house was too small. Pell and 2 of the fathers built a plank addition to the north side over a long weekend. Garrett contributed lumber from the supply store in town and helped with the roof for half a Saturday without being asked. He was not good at roofing. He was thorough, which is its own kind of good. He stayed until the shingles were secure and then went back to his fencing without comment. One of the fathers, a man named Callum Brewster, whose son had calculated the volume of the grain bin, asked Nola afterward whether Garrett always worked like that. She said, like what? Like he's finishing the thing because the thing needs to be finished, not because someone's watching. She thought about it. Yes, she said, I think that's exactly how he works. In May, Garrett filed the East Quarter claim. I did the paperwork. 2 names on the title, Garrett Thomas Vane and Nola Birch. The territorial clerk in Billings, a meticulous man named Hardin who I knew from my telegraph years, noted the dual name filing without comment, as if it were entirely routine, and stamped it with the date and the district seal. The claim was recorded on May 9, 1890. Ellis Creel's competing claim was dismissed 2 weeks later for failure to establish sufficient prior interest. Aldous came by once more after that, on a mild May afternoon, and stood on the porch for 10 minutes while Garrett stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, and Nola stood at the fence watching from a distance with the kind of stillness you learn when you've been in enough situations where staying still is the correct form of resistance. Aldous did not go in the house, he left. I did not record the visit in the ranch log. Some things don't need to be in the official record to be true. June and July were the busiest months I could remember at Cassia Creek. Garrett expanded the cattle operation by 30 head, which required the east quarter pasture to be properly fenced and watered, which required 3 weeks of work that he, Pell, and 2 hired men from town performed in intervals between the summer heat. Nola taught through June and then suspended school for July, not because the children wouldn't have come, but because she spent July writing the first systematic curriculum the Cascia Flats School had ever had. A document that mapped 4 years of instruction from basic letters to geometry, organized by season and available materials, with notes on which topics could be expanded if a child showed particular aptitude. She wrote it at the kitchen table, because the north room was warm in July and the kitchen was cooler. Garrett worked in the office. They passed each other in the kitchen 4 or 5 times a day, with the specific ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that the passing is comfortable rather than effortful. I watched this from my desk sometimes, with a feeling I didn't have a precise word for. Something between satisfaction and an awareness that I was witnessing something that had cost both of them something to arrive at, and that the cost was part of why it seemed solid in a way that easy things don't. The thing about the ring was resolved quietly, the way most real resolutions happen, not with a decisive scene, but with an accumulation of small moments that add up to a different condition. I know the date because I was there, which was unusual. I had stayed late to finish the summer accounts. The cattle expansion had required a full reassessment of the operating costs, and I wanted it cleaned before the end of July, and it was past 9 in the evening and the house was quiet. Garrett had been out at the barn with Pell doing a final head count and came in through the kitchen door. Nola was asleep in the north room. I was at the office desk with the lamp turned high. He came and stood in the office doorway, not to speak to me, I think, just to stand somewhere that wasn't the kitchen. He was turning the piece of fence wire in his hands. He'd done this less as the months had gone on. Tonight he seemed to have picked it up again for specific reasons. Then he reached into his breast pocket and took the ring out. He looked at it for a long time. He turned it over. He pressed his thumb against the inner surface, the way you do when you're reading something by touch rather than sight. Then he said quietly, and I'm not sure he intended me to hear it, "I'm not finished knowing how to say goodbye to you, but I think you'd tell me to stop practicing on the living." He set the fence wire down on the desk. He left the ring in his palm. He went out to the barn, and when he came back in, his palm was empty. I did not look up from the ledger. I kept writing. When he had gone to his room, I took a blank telegraph form from my coat pocket, dog-eared the corner, and let it sit on the desk in front of me for a while. Then I smoothed it flat. I did not write anything on it. Some communications don't require words. August was ordinary in the best way. School resumed with 15 children and a new primer on state geography that the county board, somewhat surprised by the curriculum document Nola had sent them in July, had funded without argument. Garrett sold 42 head at the late summer market and came home with the proceeds and a quiet satisfaction that expressed itself as a new water barrel for the barn and an extra load of winter coal ordered in advance. Pell told me the weather had settled. Not the end of weather, he clarified, just the kind of settled where you stop bracing for it, you go back to just living in it. I had almost filled my current stack of telegraph forms with dog-eared corners. I started a new stack. October 14th, 1890 was a Tuesday, the 1-year anniversary of Nola's arrival on the Cascia Flats stage. I went to the ranch that morning as I always did. Nola's coffee was already made. The second cup was turned upside down beside the pot. Garrett's boots were by the door clean, he'd wiped them off, which he did on Sundays. No one mentioned the date. I didn't mention it either. I went to the office and opened the October accounts. Outside the window, the creek had its first ice skin of the season along the edges. The survey maps from Garrett's office wall were still pinned to the sod house walls. Nola had replaced 2 that had gotten chalk-dusted with fresh copies she'd ordered from Billings, but the originals were still there. At noon, Garrett came in from the pasture for the midday meal, a routine that had developed somewhere in the spring and simply continued, like most of the routines that had developed between them. Nola came in from the sod house. They sat at the kitchen table across from each other with the coffee and the bread and the careful ease of people who had arrived somewhere specific without anyone declaring a direction. I stayed in the office. I could hear them, not the words, just the sound of 2 voices at a kitchen table, one low and one considered, going back and forth at the pace of a conversation that wasn't in a hurry. Around 2 o'clock, I heard the kitchen chair move. A pause, then Nola's voice, distinct and clear. "What do you want to do?" A silence. Then Garrett's voice. "What do you want to do?" Another silence, longer than the first. Then something I couldn't hear, said at a different volume. I smoothed a telegraph form flat. I kept the October accounts. At the end of the afternoon, when I was putting the ledgers away, I went to say good evening and found them both on the porch, Garrett leaning against the rail, Nola standing with her atlas under her arm, looking out at the creek where the ice edge caught the last of the October light. Garrett had something in his hand. He was turning it between his fingers, not the fence wire. I looked more carefully. The saddle soap tin, small, worn, the label gone. As I watched, he stepped off the porch. He walked to the south fence line, to the third post from the corner, where the fence had been repaired 6 years ago when a rope accident had taken a ring off his finger and left the scar that he'd been carrying ever since. He crouched down. He pressed the tin into the ground at the base of the post, deep enough to be below the frost line, with his hands flat on the earth over it for a moment. Then he straightened up and came back to the porch. I looked at Nola. She was watching him. Her expression was the one I'd been learning to read for 12 months, not warmth, or not only warmth. Something more like resolution. The face of a woman who has been doing arithmetic for a long time and has finally arrived at a figure she trusts. She reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a folded piece of paper. The folded piece of dark fabric from the windowsill arrangement, not fabric, I realized, closer up. Paper. The same paper she'd brought in her satchel. She held it out to him. He took it, he unfolded it. I was at the bottom of the porch steps and I could see it was a land survey document. A small, hand-drawn sketch of the East Quarter with measurements notated in her handwriting, the way she'd learned to notate from the Billings survey primers. Precise, clear, correct. She said I started keeping a second set of records, for the school, for the East Quarter, she stopped, for things I want to understand well enough to explain. He looked at the document for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket, the same pocket where the ring had been for 7 months. He didn't say anything. Nola didn't say anything. The October light was the specific golden cold of early Montana autumn, and the creek was making the small sound of water moving under thin ice. I went home. I sat at my own desk for a long time with a blank telegraph form. I wrote on it for the first time in a year, not an official message, not an operational account. Just this. Tell them it was quiet here, and that was exactly enough. I folded it, put it in my coat pocket, dog-eared the corner. I didn't send it. I never did send the ones that mattered, but I kept them, every one. The way some people keep things not because they can't let go, but because they've decided the keeping is its own kind of record, a proof of what was real, a way of saying, this happened and I was here and it cost something and it was worth it. The kind of ring you can't take off, even when it isn't on your finger. The kind that leaves a mark,